Thank you for joining us, everybody, for a Bog Panda First. This is our first holiday Panda game review. And for all the Halloween cucks out there, I have a tiny pumpkin. Now, tonight we're going to talk about a special game, a movie tie-in game, everybody's favorite. It's Bram Stoker's Dracula, specifically the Sega Genesis edition of it, because there's 45 editions of it. So Kelly, I guess we should start with what's your familiarity with the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, which for everyone who doesn't know, wasn't directed by Bram Stoker. He wrote the book. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, probably best known as the director of Megalopolis.
Yes, his latest treasure. Um, so fair. I mean, I haven't made multiple rounds through it. I'm familiar with it. It's been a while since I've watched it, and then for the game itself, I hadn't really interacted with it much until this came up as us planning to do a Panda review on it. So I became familiar with it, and it was interesting. Cyanosis, that
Psygnosis, yeah.
Psygnosis produced it. They also did Shadow the Beast for the Amiga, and more on that later. But so mildly familiar with the movie and became familiar with the game.
Nice. So, and just so everyone knows, the movie was actually extremely commercially successful, won a couple of Academy Awards, made tons of money, and kicked off a weird franchise where basically, so since the 1980s, Universal has desperately, and we love Universal, but Universal has desperately been trying to get their monster cinematic universe back running again. There was failed attempts throughout the 80s and 90s. The closest they got was the Brendan Fraser Mummy remake, and that is a remake of their black and white Mummy movie. But even that kind of started to falter under sequels and things like that. And they've made so many attempts, and they've even tried rebooting the Mummy again with Tom Cruise, but just so many attempts to get their dark universe, they call it, off of the ground that somewhere along the line, Sony went, let's just steal it. And there's nothing they can do because most of these characters are public domain. And that's what they did. So they made Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was a huge success. They followed it up with a sequel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which kept the same aesthetics of using the author's name in the title, as well as making it a period piece. Francis Ford Coppola returned to produce it again. Kenneth Branagh directed that time. They assumed it was going to be just as big and a word baity as that one. So they immediately went into producing tons of merchandise because there was another thing in the 90s where R-rated movies were marketed directly to kids. And so there was action figures and comic books and trading cards and everything you could imagine for all of these titles. It did very well, but not nearly as well as Bram Stoker's Dracula. Still a success by any measure, but corporate decision making took over and they were like, we need to completely rethink this franchise. So for the third movie, and this is where they lost it. And let me just preface this by saying I really like the third movie, but they completely dropped their own franchise rules and decided to take the Wolfman, which was supposed to be the third movie, and drop any connection to the other movies and make it a modern day setting instead of a period drama because they thought that's what the problem was, and remade it as Wolf with Jack Nicholson, which most people at the time didn't even understand that that was the third movie in the franchise, because it's totally different the other movies, which made for a lot of, you can get very confusing looking Blu-ray and DVD box sets of the three of them packaged together where people are like, what does this have to do with these? And I actually like Wolf, but I think it was a gigantic mistake to do it that way. And of course, the movie failed commercially. But Bram Stoker's Dracula, the first of the trilogy, weirdly, um, was hugely successful and spawned a ton of video games. So to make it simple, there was a line of 8-bit games. So those were Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, and Master System. Here's the Game Gear edition of it. These are all basically the same game. Some have more content, more colors, and things like that, but it's the same design of the game, same stages and layout and things like that. Then came the 16-bit versions of the game, which were for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. These are the same game as well. Not the same game as the 8-bit versions. This is a completely different game, but they're the same game. And kind of similar to what we talked about when we did our Alien Trilogy review, these are literally the same game, just like that was on different platforms. It's really just the differences in the hardware and the way that it handles the game that are the differences in the game. And of course, Nintendo censorship. So I'll point that stuff out as we go, but there's really no point in doing two different reviews of them because they are literally identical games otherwise. There's also a Sega CD game that used full motion video backgrounds, which was a new idea at that time. The game controls very, very poorly, though. It looks cool. Like if you see stills or footage of somebody else playing, it looks pretty cool until you try and play it. And it's not. There's an Amiga game, which is another totally different game, but uses assets from the Sega CD game because Amiga and Sega had very similar architectures. So a lot of times ports between those systems were just almost one-to-one conversions, and that's where they would pull things from. Then there was a DOS game, which is a first-person shooter, so another totally different game. There was also a pinball table, and the pinball table was turned into a pinball video game. So there is a ton of Bram Stoker's Dracula games. The 16-bit ones are probably the best known ones, though. So we're going to do the Sega Genesis one. It's considered the better of the two. We'll get into that when I explain the hardware differences, but otherwise, same game. Super long-winded intro.
You know, yeah, and the um, Psygnosis, who did a number of games for the Amiga. I mean, this was like playing an Amiga game. It just,
Mhm.
I mean, uh, the palette, the feather on the imagery, even the music to a large degree. It's like, oh, the Shadow Beast became a vampire. Now there's um, a little more richness to the Dracula Genesis game than Shadow Beast. So the Shadow Beast, great game. But then there's also a lot of the very dangerous things coming up from the ground that can kill you. Psygnosis trademark, at least in most of the games I play. So they're in all kinds of places. So those make a lot of appearances in this game. And then also the uh, strange architectural decisions that are made on hallways and things when you're going up and down that might appear to the untrained eye to be built to make it a little more challenging for someone playing a platformer than an actual hallway. And I was like, why does this hallway roof kind of keep so I can't jump up here? It's like, well, I think that's part of the gameplay. So but I was just struck by how much I got to Shadow of the Beast 5 and play this game.
Yeah, it definitely especially this 16-bit version of the game, has a very Amiga and PC game feel to it. And like Kelly said, Psygnosis, that's what they did. Amiga games and PC games, that was their bread and butter. It very much shows in this game.
Yeah. And parallax scrolling, of course, which was
Yeah.
big.
So had you played any of the Bram Stoker's Dracula games?
I had not. This was all new territory, but I played Shadow of the Beast, so
So you know the Psygnosis
I got,
territory
I
then.
got, I had the vibe going. So
Yeah. I am curious to see what you think because these games, particularly the 16-bit one, so most movie tie-in games kind of get written off as bad games, but these, particularly the two 16-bit games, usually get a terrible, terrible rap. In fact, I didn't play these for a long time when they initially came out because I had just heard they were such terrible games. And it wasn't until later that I got into the Bram Stoker's Dracula video games. And they're not, in my opinion, terrible games. A couple of them are. But for the most part, there's good stuff here if you know games of that era. Like Kelly said, they're very much of that era of game. but I don't think they're bad games. I think the 16-bit games were really harmed by the fact that there isn't other platforming games that are vampire centric on 16-bit platforms other than Castlevania. And the 16-bit Castlevania games were the best-selling games of that era and are still considered to be some of the best games on their platforms or just of all time at this point. So I think they were unfairly compared to the Castlevania games because that was just the only thing that was kind of like that at the time. And I don't think most games would fare against the giant budget Castlevania games, which is already a well established franchise at that time. I don't think it's fair to compare movie tie-in games to that. And I think that's where a lot of the unfavorable reviews come from. They're not really reviewing the game, they're comparing it to Castlevania, if that makes sense.
Mhm. All right, it's been a little while since we've done a Panda review, so a reminder to those viewing at home and keeping score. The categories are fun factor, controls, difficulty, replayability, and visual appeal. 1 to 5 pandas, we've actually opened up zero, so we can go with zero panda and as well. That's not going to happen tonight, but it's available to us if necessary. So
It's good to know we have that in our back pocket.
that's right. Just sure there'll be some games coming along where that'll be the case. All right, so let's get started with fun factor and just overall enjoyment of the game, the whole thing together, the music, the gameplay, the aesthetic, all that kind of thing. I thought it was enjoyable. Like I said, I really like Shadow of the Beast. This harkens back to Shadow of the Beast in visually, spiritually, and so I'm going to go a 4 on fun factor for me.
Yeah, Psygnosis definitely had a type. And, coming from that same era, this is a look and a feel that I'm used to. Also, this is one of those tie-in games that actually pretty well represents the movie. All of the stages are scenes from the movie. All of the boss characters are mostly Dracula in the different forms, but also a couple of the other enemy leaning or antagonistic characters, giant versions of them, but still they're directly out of the movie.
Yeah.
You fight Gary Oldman in all of his different forms as Dracula. So I mean, it's pretty well representative of the movie actually, which you don't always get in these kind of tie-in things. But again, these were published by Sony who produced the movies. So I'm sure they were, a little more on top of things given it was their own property. So Psygnosis made it, but Sony published it. So as a fan of the movie and just somebody who grew up in that era of gaming and is nostalgic for that style of game, it's a 4 for me.
The next one is controls. Pretty basic set of controls that you need to use. They do the job. Certainly, I don't have any really complaints about it. Not overly complex. It doesn't have the combinations that you need for certain fighting games to say, all right, I need to do these 4 buttons in this order and that and all that. There's not as much of that going on as there are in a like a Mortal Kombat. So I appreciate that myself. So it's that I prefer games that are a little simpler from a control perspective. So 4, I think there's certainly to me nothing wrong with the controls.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of simplistic. I will say, and this is where we get to some of the differences in the game. Um, the the only difference it isn't kind of hardware based, other than a couple of sprites are different between the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions. For some reason, in the Super Nintendo version, you start with a dagger instead of your sword as your weapon, and you have to fight a few enemies to get to the sword. But the dagger is such a short range weapon that even if you kill those enemies, you end up taking damage for some reason. And that's only in the Super Nintendo one. I don't know why they did that, maybe to make the game artificially harder and take longer. I'm really not sure why. But you start with the sword instead of having to pick that up in this. It's other than that, it's pretty basic and straightforward. The controls, like Kelly said. My niece, who's very young, was over and saw me playing it while she was playing a different game got curious about it. She is not a horror person in any way. She's a little girl. She likes princesses and pink stuff. She was immediately intrigued by it, grabbed the controller, and played through the entire first level. I put it on the easiest setting for her, but still, she immediately acclimated to the controls. So while it is simple, I think it makes the game more approachable than a lot more modern games are, especially platformers. Because as far as I know, she's never really played platformers before. So this was kind of new to her, but she understood intuitively that you had to jump on the objects in the background to get to higher platforms and things like that. So there is a kind of basic intuitiveness to it, which I think is important if you want to cast a wide net for your game. So I would give it a 4 as well.
Next up is difficulty, and this is that just kind of right sizing it for not too easy, not too hard. If you kind of hit that right mark where it just keeps you challenged and going forward, but isn't punishingly difficult or ridiculously easy. Obviously, you've got options, as Mike mentioned, to adjust the difficulty factor some as well, but kind of down the middle. So I struggled here. Um, I'm gonna go 3 on difficulty, and it kind of plays into replayability. Going to be kind of coming up here next, in that while the as Mike mentioned, different scenes, some different environments, and all of that, it is a lot of the same gameplay, very similar gameplay in terms of when you here's how you deal with things that are up in the air. Here's how you deal with things that are they're down low. And once you do get the sword, if you want to fire that up like a lawnmower blade, just kind of keep it going pretty strong. To Mike's point, also, that you'll be able to create a certain amount of distance between you and what's ever coming your way, and so you can use that to not have to overly strategize to take out. You've got you need to think about some of that, but really most of the boss levels and all that, it is saying, how do I avoid, enough damage to take the boss out? And it's nice, they've got a little vial that kind of goes down so you can kind of keep track of where the boss's strength is at. Um, so it's not really a criticism of it, but I was just kind of going, with this, because of kind of a certain couple elements that really you didn't have to once you figured out how to, for your niece, what she learned on that first level will serve her well for the remainder of the levels. So like I said, not really a criticism of the game, but just in going through there, I'm gonna go 3 on difficulty.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same place. Only thing I would add, everything that Kelly said, I agree with. The only thing I would add is I'm not a giant platformer fan in general. These are not my favorite kind of games. It makes sense to do it for this kind of game. If I'm going to get into a platformer, ironically, it's going to be something like Castlevania. But Castlevania adds, a leveling up system, backtracking, collecting items, and things like that. There's just more to it. This falls into the more standard platforming type of game where there's things that just pop up out of nowhere, forcing you to take damage. And you also have to make blind jumps at times, which is the things I don't like about platformers. That's not skill. It's just artificial difficulty to make you replay it and learn things. So that's the only thing that kind of knocks it down for me. Other than that, the difficulty I think is in line with other similar games of the time. Uh, Going to the hardware differences, I do think the Super Nintendo version is a little bit harder because of the nature of starting you with a shorter range weapon, forcing you to take damage on those early enemies where you really don't have to. The Super Nintendo version also, there's no good place to stick this because this isn't really a category that we're looking at. The Super Nintendo version struggles a little bit. While Sega is the older hardware, the Genesis is older hardware than the Super Nintendo. And when we get to graphics, I'll talk about what the Super Nintendo does. Where it struggles, though, is that the Sega still had the better processor. Nintendo went with a cheaper processor. They both use 16-bit Motorola processors. They went with a lower end version, figuring that games could just use helper chips if they needed to. Sega future-proofed themselves by going with a much higher end version, the same one that's in the Amiga, which is why they're able to port things back and forth so easily with them. So the Sega version, everything runs very smoothly. There is noticeable slowdown when you're playing in the Super Nintendo version, which makes it more difficult. You're going to end up taking more damage when it gets choppy in spots. There's also loading screens, which does not happen in the Sega Genesis version. Before every single boss battle, there is a full on CD-ROM style loading screen in the Super Nintendo version. I'll get to why later because the game does something really cool that we'll talk about when we get to visuals. But that's just something to keep in mind. I think this one's a three. If we were doing the Super Nintendo, it would be lower.
So replayability, going to go three here again, kind of for a couple of things I mentioned before that tactically, there's a couple techniques you will serve you well, which I don't mind. Personally, I don't want to be overly challenged, but from a replay perspective, once I go through, the levels once, revisiting each of them, there's not a lot of nuance. Unlike Beetle Adventure Racing, where actually on a couple paths, I can go here, I can go there. This I didn't. Let me try this thing a little bit differently. There's kind of a path that is the ideal path for you to follow, or about the only path for you to follow to get through there. So there's not going to be a lot of new aha moments in there, and it the boss battles, while it's a different sprite you're battling, and I mean, I guess there's some diversity, obviously as you get a little bit later in there and other things to take into account in dealing with some of the bosses. So I think that's fair. But just not as much to draw me back to say, hey, because you've kind of already repeatedly done the same thing as you progress through the levels, with nuances with each boss and the final boss. Um, so so a three, I said it's not bad. I can see myself returning to this game for fun every once in a while, but I'm gonna still stick with a three for this.
Yeah, I'm in the same place again as Kelly. This is a three for me. I think there's more replayability if you're a fan of the movie than
Fair.
if you're not. You're gonna revisit it a little bit more. They do try at least if you choose a lower difficulty setting, you don't get to play all the levels. So you have to go with the higher difficulty settings to see every level in the game, which is a little bit of built-in replayability, which is nice.
That's
But I
fair.
do think, to Kelly's point, when you're playing a platformer like this, there's really once you beat it, there's no surprises there. So I think your replayability is going to be definitely tied to how big a fan of the movie you are.
All right, and the final category is visual appeal. Uh, so it kind of looks like an Amiga, so I'm gonna like the visuals. I think it's all pretty strong stuff. And I'm going to go with a four for visual appeal. This is when we talk about this, it's not, is it the most realistically rendered or all that? You want to kind of deal with the constraints of a platform. And so here we're in 16-bit land. It's one of the things that made the Amiga stand out was that you were getting these really kind of pretty cool visual games. The things that look pretty cool visually you weren't seeing as much on other platforms. Uh, this reads across the same way, so I think it looks really good. I always like the Psygnosis aesthetic anyway. I think it's just kind of cool, and so I'll go four.
Yeah, I'm going to go four as well. This is where I'll talk about the other major differences between the Super Nintendo and this. First, in the opening cutscene, which I think looks really great in both versions, the Super Nintendo version is censored. In the cutscene in the beginning of the Genesis one, there are impaled bodies on spikes as the camera moves across to Gary Oldman's Dracula in his armor. And then you get the title screen. There's the impaled bodies twitching and stuff on spikes. That's cut out of the Super Nintendo version. Typical for the time, Nintendo is really big on censorship. There's a really cool transition into each level where there's a book motif of Van Helsing's book and then it's zooming in on an image of the book and that being the level that you start. It handles it in two different ways. The Genesis is using a cropped edge of the screen, and then the cropping is the book. So the cropping just moves out, unveiling the screen, but it gives you the same illusion of you zooming into the book. But really, they're cropping the screen and then removing the cropping. The Super Nintendo version actually uses Mode 7, its background scaling hardware, which is cool in theory. But what ends up happening, because they're scaling down the entire background to like a postage stamp size and then blowing it up, again, slower processor, it has to pause before and after it does that to load. So that's your first loading times. So and it's noticeable. It's like at least 10 seconds, I would say, to get that going. Then once you get to the boss battles, like I said, there's a full-on loading screen, which is not something you expect to see on a cartridge game. Cartridge games do still load the games before anybody says anything in the comments. They just tend to load most of the game at once, or if there's other things they need to load, they find clever ways to hide it, like little interstitials between levels and things like that. This has a loading screen that comes up, which isn't great. The reason that it does that before the boss battles, though, is the bosses in both games, very impressively, are gigantic sprites. That was something that was extremely hard for the 16-bit systems to do. Sprites that took up the whole screen. It's one of the main complaints and one of the first things you notice when you see arcade to home conversions in the 16-bit era. Everything is scaled down really significantly because they were strict, whichever processor you're using, really strict constraints on sprite sizes. So doing anything that was above that was really taxing on the hardware. So the Genesis, though, again, just brute forced its way through everything with its blast processing. You just immediately are onto the boss fight. There's an actual stop, a loading screen, the music stops, everything on the Super Nintendo to load that. Either way, though, it's very impressive when you know that it can't really do this. And they figured out a cool way to make this happen of these screen filling giant sprites. So that's pretty cool. Otherwise, the game looks like a Psygnosis game. Like Kelly said, if you like that aesthetic, which I do, you're going to like this game. Surprisingly, both the Super Nintendo and Genesis otherwise look identical. I say surprisingly because the Super Nintendo had a much bigger color palette, but this looks just as colorful. In fact, they side by side, unless you saw the book zooming or something that gives away which, or the loading screen, so it gives away which version you're looking at, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. So I'm going to go with a four as well.
Yeah, and the initial kind of default Amiga palette for gameplay and all that kind of stuff wasn't as massive as like Super Nintendo. And the Psygnosis made their stock and trade in, and Cinemaware is another one. There were game developers for Amiga that really squeezed out everything they could with it. Not a teeny palette, but nothing approaching where we're headed in terms of palette sizes. So they got a lot out of a pretty tight number of colors to work with. So we lined up exactly on this one. Puts us at 18 and 18. I'm going to jump over to our whiteboard tag. And we have Mike and my respective lists so far. And you have those up as well, Mike?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So, interesting. So we're both at 18.
Mm.
Seems to be a favorite score of mine.
Yeah,
So
I was going to say you have quite a few 18s
have
there.
quite a few
Although
18.
looking at these, only one game is really far apart for both of us,
Yeah.
which is Paperboy.
Yeah, that's the one big difference we've had so far. Um, no, yeah, even Berserk's close. Yeah, we're right at the same score on that. Yeah, so Paperboy is the only one that's really different so far. I mean, and then you get to the top. I question Mike's objectivity on his road rash scores, but do the math on that. Those fives across the board for road rash. So, so you know, observe that.
That and Berserk are the two that I struggle with because I don't, and it's the graphics on both of them because I don't think either one looks good, but I think they look good for what they are.
That's fair. That's fair.
So those are the two that I always struggle with. So Road Rash would, even if I knocked it down a point in graphics, would still be my number one because it would just be a 24 instead of 25 because everything else is still a five for me. But maybe someday I'll adjust those. But for now, I'm still
Yeah.
happy with the placement of
Okay.
everything.
Yep. So that drops. Do you want that ahead, or since it's tied with Berserk, do you want it listed ahead or behind Berserk, or do you care?
I guess it doesn't matter because they're tied. I'll say ahead though. I do
That's
like it a little more than Berserk, I think.
that's fair. Yeah, and for me, and so that kind of nestles in there around number seven for you. For me, like I said, I have a whole raft of 18s there. Um, I would put it at the top of the 18s I have there. So it'll
Nice.
be in my number six. So we'll we will adjust those accordingly. Okay. I'm gonna jump back out of the whiteboard and um anything else you want to kind of add on? It's been a little while since we've done a pay per view. It's nice to we'll have to get back to that. And we've talked about maybe coming into it. We knew Pac-Man for the 2600 wasn't going to fare well, but that was kind of a bully move. It was obvious. So we may just find another game that we think there's a possibility we'll start to round out the bottom part of our list a little bit more. So we'll see on that.
Not as many 18s and 19s.
Yes. So we could get a little diversity in the scoring. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, no, I do think it's interesting that we are, even though, we might be a point or two away on some, most of ours are pretty close.
No.
It's really just Paperboy where we
Yep,
have to
that's
move
really
on.
been the only one so far. And I think if I did have a controller that were shaped like handlebars, I might have scored it differently, but I didn't. So I had to score it with a controller I was forced to use.
Bog Panda.